Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another wonderful episode of the War Report. We got a lot of ground to cover, and I didn't even take a day off. Like, it's been a week since we recorded. We recorded last Saturday night, put the episode up on Sunday afternoon. We're recording Saturday night right now, and we're going to put it up on, Sunday afternoon, 12, 12:30, whichever time I decide. So, hello to all of you here. To all you on the West Coast, if you're not in church, I will find you, and you will answer for that. But that's aside the stories today. So, beginning today, we have some news out of the Middle East. Now, Israel, the Zionist state as some may call it, has decided to launch strikes against Syria. Now, one may look at this and think it's just a routine thing. This has been happening for 12 years at this point. In fact, even longer. If you go, even before the outbreak of the war, they hit the reactors in '07, and just typical Middle Eastern back and forth with that. And this is, of course, on top of two major news events out of Russia, unrelated, semi unrelated to the current conflict in Ukraine. And that would be Russia's new agreements with Syria, Russia redeploying to Syria, and again agreeing to supply them with more military equipment, particularly in the field of air defense. And this also follows agencies that fled to Israel, so I'll leave you to connect the dots there, have been shut down in Russia or pressured to cease operations in Russia this week. Now, this follows a general trend that has been happening since February. A lot of these advocacy organizations for Jewish people, both in Russia and abroad, have slowly but surely packed up shop. Now, there are state pressures just generally against open dissent of the conflict right now against people who are trying to actively impede the war effort, but none of these were directly shut down. They didn't have SWAT teams kick down the doors and arrest all the people there. And I'll leave you to speculate whether you think that'd be a good or bad thing, and I will abstain from my opinion on that particular topic. But through both internal and external pressures, they have relocated primarily in Israel as well as other places in the West. And you can think of these organizations similar to the Anti Defamation League in the United States, or even when it comes to some more policy issues like APAC or the ZOA in the United States. So these organizations that exist all across the world, primarily in the English speaking world and secondarily in Europe, also have a foot in the door in Russia for obvious reasons given the past century of history with Russia and the trials that it has undergone, leaves it with an even more complex relationship with the Jewish people than even most other European nations and peoples as well. So the tides are turning in that regard, and there have been an idea coming around because there was a semi-popular narrative at the beginning of the war that, of course, this is all just a kabuki theater, that they're just puppeteering this all, and this is to cover up for XYZ, in which case they will take opportunities to cover up for XYZ. They will even instigate things to cover up for XYZ. But I think the evacuations of these agencies is a bit too far into the crazy 40 chess realm, but I'm not discounting the possibility entirely. I'll give just the slightest amount of possibility that you should get to any sort of statement like that. But it is certainly safe to say that this is a genuinely two or even multi-sided conflict when it comes to that realm of influence in particular, because they have packed up, they've left, they've issued statements of condemnation not only for the outbreak of the conflict itself and I think even going all the way back to Crimea and the Donbass, if I recall correctly, but also just the number of other tensions that have been going on since the 1990s and even before. So you could interpret this as tentatively good news when it comes to the fight for national sovereignty, that these sort of organizations are being kicked out or shut down. And I do have to clarify, of course, it's not just those. There's other organizations as well that are of different political stripes, as
Yeah,
tends to.
like Bellingcat, for
Yes,
instance,
and of course,
which Russia has made illegal. A
yeah.
lot of countries could get rid of Bellingcat, and they wouldn't be called anti-Semitic. I mean, who knows? Maybe they will,
Oh,
but
they would find a way to
there's a
justify it,
start.
or they would say, oh, it's a domino effect where it starts with Bellingcat, but what about X, Y, or Z organization that we're very passionate about for some reason? A few years down the road, they love to do that stuff. They love to invoke the slippery slope when it actually is true. They love to invoke it when it either when it will when it will be to their detriment when again things like that. But they love to deny it, to hell and back when it comes to things like a Bergefeld and say, well, it's just about the bedroom. Love is love, and then you can look at the streets of any Western city in summer 2022, and you'll get your answers on that. And of course, there's several other examples you can list. For example, abortion from the 70s to the 90s was something that was supposed to be safe, legal, and rare. It's something that would, despite not outlawing it, we're going to try to prevent because we do recognize it as a social ill. It's something that we need to make sure it is celebrated. We need to make sure that it is a codified right and that it's a good thing if you make this quote unquote personal choice for whatever reason. So you can see just getting on the tangent of slippery slopes right there. But
Yeah.
once again, Russia is on a campaign to no one's surprise, and maybe outsiders are taking notes, whether they be in Western countries or non-Western countries, about how to cleanly, without too much violence or arrest or really hard state power, shut down organizations that work directly against the benefit of your state and your people. So I imagine this is the first of many to come. There will be many organizations of a Zionist nature and of a non-Zionist nature, as I have previously gotten into, that will receive the same treatment, whether it's an official punishment, whether it's behind-the-scenes pressure, or whether it's a preemptive leaving.
Yeah, I mean, there is another. I mean, of course, we know about the CEO of Yandex who left. Um, of course, her reason was that she could not stay in a country that it would invade another country, so she moved to Israel. Like the the lack of self-awareness.
Yes, and we have
But
used Yandex technology on the show, I will say.
yeah, yeah. So there is also, of course, the another story everybody remembers, Pussy Riot. Um, Back maybe well over a month ago, Lucia Stein of Pussy Riot also
Very
left.
Russian.
Yeah, Stein, Lucia Stein. She
Clearly,
apparently left
just one of those
with.
Catherine the Great Germans, of course.
Yeah, so she was, of course, she's had to wear an electronic angle tag for, I guess, a few years with a GPS tracker, but the police became lax, and so she figured out that she could just like, walk around and nobody would notice. And apparently, she left with her Xbox and I think a skateboard or something. I don't know if this is just an embellishment of the writers for 1843 magazine. Um, but anyway, so yes, she's gone to Lithuania, and she's pictured with her rat. This was on June 1st, so I assume she left prior to June. Um,
Yes,
so
I
yes,
think so too.
there's a lot of them leaving. We had the oligarchs leaving for Israel. I believe it was the day before the Russians hit that NATO base Yaroviv just outside of Lvov. So, which in itself is pretty interesting. But yeah, so that had 10 chartered flights who landed in Tel Aviv. So, yeah, it is an ongoing trend, and it is a question of loyalty. And if you don't, I guess if you don't like the war, then shut up. Now, it's not different than what's happening in other European states.
Or what
There
happened
was,
during the Iraq War. Granted, technology was much less what it was today, but you did have centuries of protest and more or less a soft suppression of those rather than like
yeah,
it wasn't like Vietnam where they were like getting fire hosed, but it was certainly a soft suppression of opposition to the war from any side. Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul, just for right wing examples, were routinely mocked for years because they questioned the excess of American foreign policy. And even some of the more lefty people, like maybe like a Bernie Sanders or someone like that, also, when it comes to the Democratic primaries and when it comes to internal Democratic Party affairs, they are the outcast because despite the fact I will once again clarify these people are not on our side, we don't really agree with them on very much, they do have a moment of clarity here and there and they get ostracized and shunned for it.
Right, right. And one might have to reimagine the situation if, let's say, America was engaged in a war with Mexico. Uh, how much? It's one thing to protest about a war that's like 8,000 miles away, right? In a country you can't find on a map and you don't care about. I'm talking about Iraq or
Oh, yes.
Afghanistan, for instance. But what if it was Mexico? What if Mexico was shelling the border?
And you could even
And
make, claims that the cartel activity, even if it's not a war against the Mexican government, just because of how disordered it is, that the U.S. government theoretically has the right to put down any disorders that threaten U.S. citizens, just to bolster the
right.
example.
I think the censors would be even stronger. I really do. And I mean, who knows? In 20, 30 years, America might find itself in that position. But it's not really very different. There was a man in Czech Republic that was arrested for 3 years. There's a warrant for a German journalist who's in the Donbass, who's been there for quite a while. There is a warrant for her arrest for 3 years. Her bank account has been frozen. And that's strictly for just writing articles as she sees events taking place in Donbass, right? So it's not like there are other cases
And if you want
where,
some antiquated examples, you can go back through U.S. history through World War II. There was state-sponsored censorship. World War One, especially the Civil War. Lincoln and his generals despised journalists during the Civil War. So, I mean,
yeah,
this is normal operating procedures. Sure, it might make you feel a bit uncomfortable, and maybe in some cases that is a justified feeling, but this isn't a unique persecution of any particular class that Putin himself uniquely engineered and organized.
right. And I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong. None of these people have been arrested, right? Like, um, Lucia Stein, of course, got arrested because she did all kinds of things breaking the law. So she deserves it. But I'm
Yeah,
talking
but it's
about
just more or less in those cases like an official notice to shut up.
right, right, right. So the head rabbi of Moscow wasn't threatened with incarceration. He wasn't thrown in a jail overnight. He left because, and like the oligarchs, they left because they have no intention of like keeping quiet, just literally keeping quiet. So that tells you that they're adversarial. They're not just against the war, like they're adversarial. And this war for Russia is literally make it or break it. It's not an adventure in Syria, right? Which in and of itself is more serious than even America going into, say, Iraq.
Yes, Russia would be very
First of all,
uncomfortable
Syria is
without
much closer
Syria.
to Russia.
Um,
Second of all, Russia has assets there that are important to it. But so these none of these people were threatened with their lives or thrown in prison. They left because, I mean, you can call it conscience, but really what they're saying is I can't remain quiet. In fact, I want to work against Russia in this war. I know how important it is for Russia, but I don't care. I'm still going to work against it. I hope they lose. Like, it's just, you know.
and there were, on
Anyways,
the
they're gone.
contrary, some more liberal-minded people. I'll say that because they weren't, of course, like Western liberals, but more liberal-minded Russians who have gradually changed their minds after seeing the
Yeah.
anti-Russian vitriol put out of the U.S. and other Western countries in the outbreak of this conflict.
Yeah, like film director Mikhalkov. I remember the first time I visited Russia, and I mentioned that I like Mikhalkov films, and particularly Burnt by the Sun, and what is it, the Siberian or Mongolian Barber, and the girl I was talking to, she was like, I mean, uber patriotic. She considered him liberal scum. She goes, he's terrible. How could you like him? He's anti-Russian. It just kills me to hear
Oh yes, and it's always it's funny because you always watch these street interviews, and there was one of them about like, well, if you had your finger on the red button aimed towards the west, would you
Yeah,
push it? And most people know, and it's some like 30-year-old, presumably just like housewife saying, "Well, absolutely, I would."
yeah. And the ironic thing was she's only a quarter Russian, right? So her dad is half Russian, half Lithuanian, and her mom and half Ukrainian. But the Greeks have been in Ukraine for centuries, right? Since Catherine the Great. And so technically, she's only quarter Russian, right? And I remember like, wow, okay, I will not discuss Mikhalkov, but not to wander too off topic. Mikhalkov has been quite vocal and supports the war effort. And every time you see this guy interviewed in his office, he has icons everywhere. So yeah, it's interesting. He's not the guy I thought he was, and it reminds me of photos of Tarkovsky, and especially the Polaroids of him and other shots because he did a whole book on his own Polaroids.
And even though I think this man would say anything just for the slightest bit of gratification, you have to remember that Navalny's positions were considered hard conservative in a lot of Western countries when it came to his stances on immigration and the Muslim question within Russia. And I believe he
Yeah,
also gave a half-hard defense of Crimea as well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think he went through some transition period, beginning with Crimea and then afterwards. I mean, he's an opportunist, right?
Yes, he'll say
Like
whatever he's
the,
being
the
told to say. But
yeah,
point being is
I
like
mean,
these this is the kind of rhetoric that is needed to build even a support base.
right. There's no support base without it. And the thing is, America complains about the Russian influence on the right in America and the West, but the truth is, um, there's always been influence of the right in Russia and in the in the time of the Soviet Union, but particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union. Like Charlottesville had members of Azov that were there. Um, so there were at least one or two that participated in the January the 6th. I'm not condemning anything. I'm just saying, like,
Yeah, and Patriot
um,
Front, who's gotten a lot of attention lately, and people ask, are they plants? Are they not plants? They've had volunteers go to Ukraine as well.
right, right. So, and like, I mean, a lot of people think like you have to work really hard to convince these guys to go there. You do not, right? Because within the West, particularly in America, I would say it's stronger there than it is in Canada or Britain. But there's this idea like they're commies, they're always going to be commies. Commies are evil. Um, uh, so even if they're not commies anymore, they're just pretending, or it doesn't matter, their past they were commies, therefore it doesn't have a really nuanced view of like of the Soviet Union and the various phases that it went through. Like I say, even Mikhalkov, and Tarkovsky, they're both Orthodox Christians during this time. Uh, I'm not saying that it was pleasant, but there was a certain amount of a small amount, let's be honest, of religious expression that was tolerable. I know when I was growing up in Yugoslavia, that was also the case. You just couldn't rise that far up the ranks. But
Yes, and like
Tarkovsky
in
and
cases like, I think it was particularly like Romania and Poland were really bad. So it's like a spectrum across like the former Warsaw Pact countries.
right, right, and yes, Tarkovsky did leave Russia. He always said he didn't leave it because of oppression or anything, but that um, um, it was difficult for him to work with European actors and directors like Bergman. So there were other reasons. I don't know how honest or straightforward that was, by him to say that, but whatever. Anyways, um, all to say that yes, um, even Russian liberals in the humanities have thrown. their support behind the war and Putin in this.
Yes, and one last thing I will say on the note of Syria is that an IRGC delegation did visit Syria about a week before strikes, including the
Yes,
successor
that's right.
to the assassinated Soleimani. Now, he is Major General Hossein Salami, like the meat. I imagine it's pronounced different, but I don't really know how they pronounce it. But a touch ironic considering the Islamic position on dietary laws, but I digress with that. So they were in a delegation. Uh, they went to really where the concentration of the fighting in Syria is taking place now, near the northwest. The IRGC delegation met with Maher al-Assad, who is the commander of the Tiger Forces and also brother of President Bashar al-Assad, as well as other mid and high-ranking state officials. If we had to just start taking guesses, because they only release so much from these meetings for obvious reasons, they probably are planning the final strokes on Idlib, thus vindicating yours truly.
Yes, we're all hoping the same thing. I mean, you know, of course, there was the meeting in Iran. It was in Iran, was it not? Between
It was in
Russia.
Syria. Wait, no, that this meeting in particular I'm talking about is in Syria, but the other one was in Iran.
Yes. It's just, it's interesting that they both line up very quickly, one after the other. And, as usual with Erdogan, there are mixed messages. But what I take away from that meeting is that there will be some kind of an effort. Never count Erdogan out for botching it up, but I would say that there is an effort to resolve Syria. Erdogan did goes, and again, take it with a grain of salt. Erdogan said, for this to succeed, America must leave Syria. All right. And of course, there was another recent ship. There was another batch of oil and wheat that was stolen from northeastern Syria by the U.S. and moved into Iraq. And as long as we're talking about Iraq, there have been skirmishes, small casualties on both sides. I've seen reports of a couple of Turkish servicemen being killed, but also some Kurds in Turkey, including a woman fighter, also being killed. So Erdogan's offensive still technically has not started. And I find it interesting that there was this meeting. There are two more scheduled meetings. I suppose the next one will be in Moscow, and the one after that will be in Ankara. So I think they do want a resolution on Syria. Um, the important thing, I think, will be to get some of the Saudi states like Qatar to go along with it, and probably elements within Saudi Arabia, but that also includes the US and possibly Israel, to just essentially give up. Like, you're not, like, stop supplying weapons to these idiots. They're not going to get the country that they want. It's over. Um, most of their men who could have taken over have already fled and are living their lives in Europe right now. So, um, I mean, I look forward to that. This is a war that is now in its 11th year. And it's, 11 years is a long time. I remember when we hit 10 last year,
Oh yes.
and I just thought, like, a decade. It's just unbelievable to me that it's a decade old. So hopefully, I mean, I think America will refuse to do it. Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia and Israel, of course, he reiterated that he would not leave the Middle East. He would not allow it, to allow a vacuum to come in,
Yeah,
which
and that was
means he's
also
going to.
immediately followed by the Saudis striking a tentative deal with Russia, whereby Saudi
Yes.
Arabia imports Russian oil and then sells it westward.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, just 2 days after Biden left Saudi Arabia, uh, Bin Salman phones Putin and basically tells him, I don't know where he got this idea that we're going to increase the production just for him. we're on a target to increase production by 2027, and we're not going to sell it for less. So, and as you mentioned, they're literally buying Russian oil for their own uses, and they're selling theirs at a higher price.
Yeah, India has done a similar thing where it will import an excess of oil and then sell it to Western countries to circumvent the sanctions. And I also expect other nations will be soon to follow suit because India is too much of a hot ticket item, so to speak, where the West won't commit to sanctions against India because they
They have
believe it's
hopes.
it's some possibility of reconciliation with India, and B also despite all the superpower 2020 jokes you make, India is an ascendant player on the world stage especially when it comes to economic capacity.
Right. I mean, as long as we're talking about numbers and, you know, second largest human population on the planet, and they have a need for fossil fuels, it's a player. It's an important market. And it's going to have, determining effects on a lot of things. So, I don't even think about the whole superpower thing because everybody else who's the realist about this, and this includes like you, me, the U.S. State Department, they know how important India is in this regard, right?
Oh, it's arguably a crown jewel at this point when it comes to because it is out of the burgeoning relationship with Russia. I would say it is the weakest link, which makes them want to target it more. And because it also is the weakest link, they will try also bribery and flattery before they resort to coercion. Not that they're really in the position to resort to coercion at this time either.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Biden essentially has failed at, getting the global South and Asia to turn on Putin. You know, that hasn't happened. They're not going to do it. Uh, it's not always that they have a grudge against America. They just have their own problems, and for them to follow America would mean like their own destruction.
Yes, and China isn't even undercutting Russia when it comes to energy prices. They're buying it
No,
actually higher than the market price this time because even though it is
yeah,
more expensive, there is a recognition that the partnership, for the time being, I won't speculate in the too far future, even though I have my opinions on that, is too vital to knock the American empire off its pedestal for them to be undercutting each other and stabbing each other in the back at this moment.
yeah. I mean, I would say the partnership will be like this at least for another decade.
Oh, yes, certainly. And that, of course, is very contingent on how fast the descent of the American Empire is. And, of course, there's always black swan events, there's always things we can't anticipate. But just looking at general trends, I agree with you.
Yeah,
And with
yeah.
that being said, would you like to begin your minutia minute at the 28-minute mark?
Sure, sure, sure. Okay, so the minutia minute, I'm going to go from south and ride that crescent to the east and then back northward. So there has been a ton of stuff going on. There have not been a lot of changes either for the Ukrainians or for the Russians in terms of the battlefield red line. Gray lines have moved here and there, in other words, no man lands, but generally speaking, except for a few hundred villages, these are very small in northern Donbass as Russia increases its march towards Bakhmut and Seversk, and from the north, Slavyansk. There has not been that much movement. However, there have been a lot of developments, particularly with Ukraine um attacking various bridges. One was a railroad bridge, which also happens to be on top of the dam in Novakhovna. And now that was shelled. Well, okay, so a power generation station next to it was shelled. It's still working, but essentially what they're trying to do is stop the transport of military hardware into the Kherson region on the north side of the Dnieper River. That is the side that is closer to Mykolaiv, or as the Russians call it, Nikolaev. Um, so another attack was put on an area closer to Kherson. So Kherson is, in this area, and Kohovna is to the east of that. There was another bridge closer to Kherson that was attacked. It was damaged. Another attack was attempted yesterday with 12 HIMAR missiles. All of them were intercepted. So the Russians went from not being able to intercept them. Then they intercepted 4 out of 12 that hit uh, the bridge, the road bridge, not the railroad bridge. This is the one closer to Kherson. It would be like not quite a suburb, but it'd be a little further out than Kherson. Um, Now, of course, they're going to try other tactics. Maybe they're going to launch Tochka U's. Maybe they'll blend them with other missiles in order to confuse Russia's air defense systems. The Russians have sent in their S-400 in this region. So the S-400 is a cut above the S-300. And the S-300s that they had a few weeks back, when the dam was almost hit, they had far fewer of these air defense systems outside of Crimea. So it looks like what has happened is more systems have been shipped in, and at this rate, they are S-400s. And I believe this is why they've been able to intercept many, many more of the HIMAR missiles.
I didn't get a chance to listen to it, but I am of the understanding that Colonel Douglas McGregor gave an interesting report on Ukraine in the past week on one of these news stations.
I saw him with that kind of Napolitano recently. Um, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, I've watched so much of this stuff. He was talking basically about, and we'll get to it, but he was talking about the palace coup that might be taking place in Zelensky's uh, room, so to speak. Um, he's basically saying that Ukraine cannot win this war. They're running out of material again, because you have to remember, um, they are hitting, and again in Mykolaiv, they hit another training camp. They are hitting depots that are filled with M777 cannons from the U.S. The Russians now claim that they have taken out 4 HIMARS. One of them might have been sold. I'm hearing more chatter about that, but I haven't seen any photos. So who knows? But they are looking for them, and there are apparently 3 HIMARS systems that are in the Mykolaiv area, which is just adjacent to Kherson.
Yes, and that's what I had gathered as well. And if you do have any other additional topics on the minutia minute,
Yeah, yeah, I do. So I'm just going to continue forward. So the other theater of clashes going on, of course, is for the Donbass, the northern part of Donetsk in particular. Um, there was an attempt by the Ukrainians to cross over into Izium. Now, Izium is like an area that, like, if you wanted to get the Russians from the rear, that's where you would go. You would go from behind, and then you would bottle them up. But no, I've seen the Ukrainians try this several times. It has not worked. Zelensky, to just briefly go back to the southern front, uh, Zelensky has said, like, well, one of his ministers had said, no, there isn't a 1 million man army. We're not going to go. And that was a misunderstanding. My English isn't very good, so forth and so on. But based on the way they are attacking the bridges, the supply lines for Russian forces in the Kherson region, And then Kherson City, I would say that they are going to try to mount something. Now, there have been four small waves that have been knocked back. So far, it's not been successful. They have taken heavy losses as a result. Apparently, if you go to military analysis channel, apparently about 260, 270 men were killed in one of the brigades. That's almost like an entire battalion. So, it's not going well for them, but it's not the big, million man army that they were promising. But, far from it. Now to just, briefly go over Donetsk. So they are inching towards Seversk. Seversk as a city, I mean, as a town, is not a really big town, but it's in a valley, and all around it are hills. Um, the Ukrainians are mostly in the west, and they're firing from not necessarily the hilltops, but from behind hills. And it's difficult to ascertain their locations as a result. Some fighting in Avdiivka, which is very close to Donetsk City, just on the way to Gorlovka, uh, has intensified there. There's been some small incremental steps and new territory that's been acquired there, but these are very small gains. The Ukrainians have shot back. They blew up today what apparently to some source, well, I saw three sources. One of them said it could be a tank repair shop. Um, the other is in Rubonorzhye, which is not far from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. A granary was destroyed, and which is ironic because all you hear in the Western media is starving Africa, and only the Ukrainian grain can save the world, and the Russians just won't let them do it. We'll get to this topic. We'll expand on that, but I mean, Ukrainian exports are only like 1%. It's not huge. Most of the reason this is happening is because Russian grain and Russian fertilizer is being sanctioned, not, and the grain that has come out of Ukraine has been by land vis-a-vis Poland. And that's grain that, was supposed to go elsewhere. It kind of reminds me when COVID first hit and the US just stopped flights of masks that were supposed to go to other countries, and they just took them. So, anyways, it's the hypocrisy is always hilarious. It's always fun noticing it. Um, but that's all I've got for the minutia minute. Like I say, it's very heavy fighting. If the Russians are not advancing, you've got basically two scenarios that are going on, uh, and both could be right. One is Ukraine has sent in far more reinforcements, which they have, and they're being very competent right now, and they are successfully holding back the Russians. The other is, so there's more chatter. Lavrov has said something about a much bigger effort is about to start. So the fighting on the Russians' part could be right now just containment, and they're waiting for a much larger effort to ensue. Because again, a lot of this fighting, these are volunteer battalions from Lugansk and Donetsk, Cossacks, Chechens, all kinds of people that have gone to the front to fight. There is even a Ukrainian brigade that is now being formed in Kherson, and that too will go into action soon. So that's all I've got for the minutia minute.
Well, thank you once again for your meticulous documentation of all of this because I'm not trying to sell myself too short here, but you go, you would blow me out of the water if I had to do the show with alone or with anyone else. So, once again, just put like the little clappy emojis, or just put compliment our good co-host GSP right now, and that is not a
Thank you,
request, that is
thank
an
you.
order. But once again, with the news out of Ukraine, what is many times just as interesting and pivotal is the news in response to Ukraine, particularly in Europe. So, Orban released some statements today, uh, starting with the one particularly related to Ukraine.
Woo!
I want to quote this directly. And
He's been saying a lot of stuff,
oh yes, since the
not just about Ukraine.
oh yes, and there'll be plenty of that to come. So Viktor Orban believes that that the Ukraine will never win this war. The agency quotes Orban saying why Kiev is not able to win a military confrontation simply because the Russian army has an asymmetric superiority, and this is from Reuters, this direct report. The Hungarian leader has also said there's no chance between peace talks with Russia and Ukraine because Russia wants security guarantees, and this can only be ended by peace talks with the United States, which is exceptionally true. And speaking
Hmm.
of the United States, he gives a very interesting statement about the near future of the country. Orban says by 2030, the problems of the Western world will pile up and the USA will be in a serious crisis. Hungary must prepare for the year 2030 in order to remain a successful local exception in the period of global crisis that will affect Europe and the United States of America. And once again, that is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who recently, at the beginning of the year, won a overwhelming victory in parliamentary elections. Him and his party Fidesz, very popular within Hungary to say the least, and his opposition is only further to the right of him.
Yes.
Now, once again, I think
And his
Orban.
minister visited Putin.
Oh yes, Sciarto, I believe it is. You're
Yeah, and
Hungarian.
they secured an oil deal or a
Y-
gas deal.
yes, and we certainly have plenty of energy news to come. But once again, Orban is very articulate about the problems in the near future. As you had joked with me, Orban
Yeah.
is a regular listener to the War Report, which, if case, Mr. Prime Minister, we love you. We'd like to have you on someday for an interview. I know you
If you
speak
can
good.
go on Tucker's show, you can come on our show, dude. Come
Yeah,
on.
we're more fun than Tucker, too. Not to say that Tucker isn't fun, but we're a lot more fun, excuse me. And I think you might even be able to have
He can
some.
be more spicy on our show.
Oh, yes, I think you might be able to have some Hungarian gab with him if I am correct. I believe you have very limited knowledge.
I think so, yeah.
Oh, wonderful. I, on the other hand, could not, so I would leave that section to you. But with all of that being said, once again proves to be this bellwether for Europe, and it seems that those who have listened to him since 2015 have usually been in the right, and those who have not have usually been in the wrong, which brings up two major situations in Europe that have faced us. So, Italian Prime Minister Sergio Mattarella saw the writing on the wall and dissolved the Italian parliament, which will, in all likelihood, lead to another round of elections. Now, for those of you who have looked at the polling data, it is, in short, a blue wave. Now, just a minor note on that in Italy and most European countries, the right wing is represented by the color blue in electoral maps and in party colors, as opposed to the United States, where blue is the color of the Democratic Party,
Establishment.
which, yes, the inner party, as one may call it, Team Blue, which does confuse the situation a bit, but not too much for us to understand. So, the highest polling party by a plurality is the Fratelli d'Italia party, which is considered the successor to Mussolini's party, from the Italian Social Republic, led by Giorgia Meloni, who is more a little bit further than what you'd expect from a right-wing populist like, say, a Salvini or Le Pen, but not quite Orban. So somewhere in that very good transition period, I would say, for a Western country, somebody who could form a very good coalition, of course. That also includes several other minor right-wing parties and not so minor parties. For example, former Prime Minister Berlusconi is still alive and still, I actually believe, a sitting legislator. So the Forza party may have it, and the Forza has tentatively good relationship with Salvini's Lega and Meloni's Fratelli, but just a general right-wing coalition is set to overwhelm the country if it comes to election. You'll recall Salvini's popularity ratings. You'll recall how the popularity ratings were decent for Conte when he had Salvini in his cabinet. And with that, you also have Draghi, who has been extremely unpopular ever since the outbreak of the you know what crisis, has of course been ousted by the president, and he was not very popular at all. So if it comes to an election, if they don't jerry rig together a coalition, then it will indeed go to the people for a vote, which, in which case, unless there is some serious shenanigans, the level of 2020 is going to be a pretty healthy right wing victory. And keep in mind, these right wing parties have also campaigned, well, not exactly campaigned on, but had an implicit understanding that negotiation with Russia is on the table. I mean, even Draghi believed negotiation with Russia was on the table simply out of his own bottom line. So we could see that. Italy is also makes up about a quarter of the eurozone's debt, so it is a very volatile country. And after the occurrence of Brexit, it is also the third largest economy within the European Union. And there is a lot of potential there for a country that people might otherwise somewhat rightfully consider a basket case.
Right. It's an important country, and there is now a growing fear of the populist right in Europe. And I think, to be honest, deep down, these politicians are far more afraid of the populist right in Europe than they are of Putin. Um, Annalena Baerbock, the FM, the foreign minister for Germany, the Green Party candidate, um, prior to the election of Schultz, uh, she made a statement recently saying, we have to do something about our energy needs and the economy, because if we don't, we're going to have a populist right takeover. Now, I don't know if the tweet was taken down, um, but it did circulate, and I have a screenshot of it that I took once I've found out about it. And that gives you, I think, an indication of a lot of leaders and a lot of parties, what they're thinking, but not saying. She's essentially let the cat out of the bag. This is kind of like the reaction back in 2015 when they had the migrant crisis. Not that that has stopped, is just that the numbers were so enormous then because of the war in Syria. Mind you, those refugees were coming and staying in Turkey and leaving Turkey even before Russia entered the war. So I've seen some people try to blame that on Russia, but really, peace in Syria is really the only way you're going to have a cut in the amount of Middle Eastern refugees into Europe. So Germany has made a proposal to deal with this, and they're asking other EU countries to cut back on their energy consumption by 15% because Germany wants to stick by um, their sanctions. And the seventh round of sanctions actually has no energy sanctions inside them. So it's some nonsense about not being able to buy Russian gold, even though very little Russian gold has ever been bought by Europe recently. It goes to other markets in the Middle East and Asia. Um, and Russia has a ton of gold anyhow that it uses for backing its ruble. It now has 5 mines that went from 4 to 5 after they bought a Canadian mine for like half the price, for like something like 360 million instead of 650. But that's the sanctions for you. And so there's going to be an effort now to backpedal a bit. And I think the change in policy on Russian fertilizer and Russian grain uh, is a clear indication of this. Now, I've seen, like, they're probably somewhere in their 20s. Young right wing guys on Telegram say Putin cucked. He should never have gone along with this. Now, mind you, these guys are Poles and Baltic guys who will, try to disclaim him and at every turn, right? But the way I see this is, as I've been saying since the war started, right? The battlefield is Ukraine, the war is global. And what Putin is doing is, all these treaties that are being signed, all these, for instance, Iran, I believe, is going to be in Shanghai agreement, but they also are now applying for BRICS, as is Argentina. And we've already mentioned that the global South is not interested in following the U.S. And there isn't much that the U.S. can do about it. I don't think. And what Putin has to do is to win these people over. Like if Lavrov is going to go to China and Iran and talk about fair trade instead of free trade, right? If that's his selling line, then he has to live up to it, right? Uh, when you're young, you don't see the importance of soft power. You don't see how that has to work in concert. The truth is, it is the West who imposed these sanctions, and it is the West that is cucking. It is they who are afraid of a right-wing populist movement arising, or with grain particularly, uh, massive, massive migration. So they've cracked. They know they can't handle any more of it. And as Orban has already stated, after listening to our show probably for the last 5 years, the West
Before
is
it
going to
even
reach a
existed,
crisis. So,
impressive.
yeah. I mean, we've been saying, 2030, 2040, that like, everything from demographics to like, you know, other economic players like China, like there are very difficult days ahead, and America and the West does not lead the way it used to. It may be unified, and that might be a sign of strength, but its overall capacity is weakened, and they cannot handle another massive migration like the kind that we had 7 years ago. So they cracked. They have to allow the grain to be sold. Fertilizer is coming to the U.S. Even the U.S. is afraid of this, right? Uh, Putin doesn't care because a lot of this stuff now, depending on the country, they're going to pay in rubles anyway. So that only strengthens his economy,
Yes, and that's on
and
top
and
of
that
the Russian
creates
central
funding for the
bank.
war.
That's on top of the
And
Russian central bank saying it won't supply oil to the price cap participants. So that
yeah,
as well.
yeah, exactly. I'm glad you brought that up. So so far we don't know how this ends, but so far he's winning this. He's winning it. Yeah, I mean, they can spin it any way they want. The fact is that Ukraine has not been able to take back any territory, and just to keep the line where it is costing them much more than it's costing the Russians. Now, I watch videos where a Russian tank will get hit, or an armored personnel carrier will get hit with an RTG, and I can watch plenty of those where the Donbass people are doing the same thing to them. Which, by the way, is like it really is a horrific thing, watching these videos, watching men struggling for their lives like this, or to imagine what it would be like to die inside of a tank as it's burning up. It's just, I mean, I wish this war would end, because these are young men, and they're losing their lives, and it didn't have to be this way.
I
So
mean, and it once again is quite literally fratricidal, whether you want to look at that from a religious standpoint. Even
yeah,
despite the schisms in Ukraine right now, they're still largely both Orthodox countries that
yeah,
are in communion with one another, and also on an ethnic level. Again, as you were saying, a quarter of people in Moscow have a Ukrainian surname, and I'm sure there's plenty more Russian surnames in Ukraine. These are cousins, second cousins, aunts,
oh
uncles,
yeah,
like any familial relationship you can think of is across the former Soviet Union, because it, once again, not just the Soviet Union but the Russian Empire had most, if not all, of these countries under its dominion, so that people could move within them, of course, to within reason, and intermarry with each other, once again within reason. And once again, it was a united polity where in 1980, if you moved from Moscow to Minsk, you figured you'd be able to go back to Moscow anytime. Now, that situation has seemed to correct itself. So, a better example, if you moved from Moscow to Kiev, you figured it's going to be smooth sailing back to Moscow, just sitting the other part of the country. It's going to be a long trip, but it's possible. And even in the early days of Ukrainian statehood, it was possible. And really, 2014 is what acts that. So I know the phrase gets thrown around flippantly and some people cringe at it, but I will say genuinely it is a brother war. That being said, I'm not saying that Russia is some great instigator who did this with no reason. Unfortunately, and you can talk about the moral qualms of when military action is necessary. I won't get too much into that, but there was a gradual escalation from the NATO side as well, and arguably more of a
Yeah.
gradual escalation.
Yeah, well, I mean, they really gave them no option. Like, what was Putin supposed to do? Just like allow Ukraine to indefinitely bomb um, the Donbass at 2014, 2015
And I do believe
levels
that.
and just like do nothing? He can't.
I'm not.
That would have caused a regime change, right?
Oh
That
yes,
would have that. Now they would not have gotten the leader that they wanted, but that would have been, a way to humiliate Russia. But I believe that someone else would have taken over, and there still would have been a war. Um, but that's who you're dealing with, right?
and once again, the
And
necessary disclaimer is that not that like Putin and Lavrov are like personally great men. I don't know them. I've never met them, and I likely will never
yeah,
meet them. But point being is, I do believe there was a earnest effort on part of Russia to solve this at the negotiating table before it
yeah.
came to this.
Yes, I think there was, and it was thrown back in their faces time and time again. And we're just talking about the 6 weeks of negotiations prior to the war. We're not even talking about the 8 years that led up to 2022, right? Yes, so it's very unfortunate, and if you look at the way the Ukrainians prepared in like in a city like in a town like Avdiivka, which I've mentioned before, if you look at like photos or videos of it, like you see trenches like just outside the town, inside the town, almost on every street there is a trench. They've been prepared. They've known that there would be this war for a long time. There's no way they expected like 30,000 Donbass people to like roll over all of Ukraine. That was
And that's
ridiculous. That was
after
never going to
issuing the
happen.
passports to the people in the Donbass. So the people who are there are the ones who are dedicated to the cause.
Right, right.
And going on to, speaking of diplomacy, going on to Russia's efforts with energy. So last Friday ended the Russian program to cease Nord Stream 1 operations for maintenance procedures. And to this day, as we're recording, the day after, July 23rd, 2022, or 23rd of July 2022, for those of you who may prefer the European nomenclature, just getting all those out of the way, has still not resumed still has not resumed natural gas shipments to Germany and to the countries along the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And it says it is indefinite. So this is what many are calling a doomsday scenario from the Western point of view with Germany. As you recall, we went through some of the recommended conservation efforts for the German people that were put out by their government about a week and a half ago, such as less time in the shower, less electricity use, and the kind of stuff that they really put out whenever there is a drought in the southwestern United States. It was on those levels, if not worse. So I suppose you'll be taking 2-minute showers and washing only your vital parts, so to speak, in order to own Putler. You won't have your air conditioning in the middle of what is an exceptionally hot summer for Europe at this time. And come winter, which even if it's a mild winter, you still will need heating. And I recall hearing about this, and you could probably recall it firsthand, about the condemnations issued to Ceausescu in Romania by balancing his national budget by severely reducing heat availability in the 1980s in Romania.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, I mean, Nord Stream 1 is now back up to like 30 or 40% capacity. And again, I do think that part of the reasons you're seeing the Europeans in panic is, Russia, first of all, has not played all its hands. It is very skillfully held back. It's been punched and punched and punched. And now, of course, Russia was already decreasing the amount of oil and gas that were going into Europe. Of course, there was the Yamal, and then Russia cut off all of it for Finland. So Finland has to buy it from Germany. Poland's contract was up anyways, but Poland and Bulgaria made like a big deal out of it. But both those countries were cut off, and the I think they're starting to understand that if Russia wants to, for some reason, not increase up to 100% where they used to be, maybe they'll do it. In the end, they're still paying for it in in rubles, which is only propping up their dollar and supporting their economy. Their economy is like literally doing better now than it was before the war, which for a war is incredibly important, right? Because all these areas that they're fighting for, I mean, they're all almost all in eastern Ukraine. And that has been a strategy for the Ukrainians is to if they lose a town, they make sure it's completely destroyed, utterly destroyed.
Quite literal scorch earth tactics.
Yes. And part of that is, of course, it's the same reason they bomb civilians, is to make them turn against the authorities, which has not happened in 8 years, and I do not believe it will happen. They just hate the Ukrainians even more. Um, and you see, failed insurgencies in Kherson. I saw a video of a car speeding away from a Russian checkpoint, and it ends up like in front of a armored personnel vehicle on a farm road, and it just gets blown to bits. And there's another video I saw where a guy is getting detained, and he admits, yeah, because they found grenades and machine guns and all that stuff. So the tactic of the Ukrainians is, well, even if I mean, we hate these people anyways. We can't exterminate them. So what we'll do is we'll destroy their towns in the process of the Russians winning them back. And maybe at some point they'll, if they still have an army left in 2 months, maybe they will decide like that the Dnieper is as far east as they go. I don't know, right? But that is the tactic: is to destroy as much land so that it's more painful for the Russians to rebuild. And this is why, like, Russia making, because Russia's actual production is slightly down, but the profits are far, far higher, several times higher than they were last year. So, and they have buyers. So, and the buyers are showing, support by buying it
Yes, and
at market or above market.
we mentioned the Chinese in particular, but there's also an interesting case out of Japan where Japan's authorities are asking Mitsui and Mitsubishi, of course, two major Japanese companies,
Yep,
to keep their share in the Sakhalin oil and gas project. So, of
that's right.
course, this was on June 30th when this unofficial order came down, and it is a sign of, once again, countries realizing the real state that they're in. And the trade deficit Japan actually owed to the United States has decreased the first time in several decades, also showing the direction at which the world is moving. And this is on top of, over the past few years, there has been a small degree of reconciliation with China, at least on the economic level, where they are agreeing to cooperate on more economic projects and loosen trade restrictions. So, Japan, despite being a literal colony of the U.S., still has some room to push back. And honestly, Japan, of all countries pushing back, and you could even say the same about Germany, shows the dire state the American Empire's enforcement arm is currently in.
That's a good point. And the other bit of news this week concerning Japan and China and America is that China is no longer the largest debt holder, the largest American debt holder. Japan is.
Yes, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you or anyone else who has sufficient knowledge at the time, that harkens back actually to the 80s and the 90s with the debt
Yes,
situation between the US and Japan.
right, and that was a big lesson for the Chinese, right? So in many ways, the Americans did not want the Japanese to exceed their economy. In my day, in the late 80s, people were talking about Japan the way they talk about China, right? Now, we were young, and in hindsight, we should have known that, Japan is very much an occupied country in the same way that Germany is, and America put in measures to make sure that Japan would never exceed them economically. And the Chinese took notice of that, and that's why I forget the name of the guy. There were articles that came out at the end of 2021 and at the beginning of 2022. Again, I'm sorry I forget his name, but he visited America in the mid 90s, sometime between 95 and 97. And one of the things that the Chinese said is we must never follow the Japanese example. So the Chinese were always preparing for this day that they could not tolerate their economy being completely in the hands of the Americans. And we've argued before on this show, for instance, that even before the war, that when we were talking about Nord Stream 2, we said um, if they shut down Nord Stream 2, it's because America considers like shutting down the economy of Germany, and therefore the EU uh, is absolute primary concern
Yes, and that's once
for.
again the scorchers policy coming out of DC right now that they're willing to scorch earth the entire continent.
Right, right. As long as, yeah, because they won't be left behind. Europe must become dependent on America one way or another. They cannot let go of Europe. And if that means financializing their economies, making them even more of a service economy, getting them more entwined with American banks, then so be it. But we are, and here's where you see like how important manufacturing really is, right? And that is what they are destroying in the same way that they targeted uh, farmers in the Netherlands, truckers, anybody that's basically self-employed, doesn't need to necessarily go through the university system. Um, I'm making a macro micro comparison here. Um, Anybody in that position is a threat to the centralizing forces of power. Power does not like that, right? And they're going to wipe them out, and they don't want people to be economically independent. And that's sort of, you know, you could look at the truckers as the EU, for instance, to a degree,
Well, I'm
right?
glad you brought up truckers and the concept of automobiles because the EU reports auto registration is the worst it's been since 1996, and it's down 15.4% to 868,510 units. And keep in mind, Europe's a continent of roughly 750 million, according to the official statistics that are put out, of course. Those statistics can never be entirely accurate, and I won't get into this topic now, and I suspect
Yes,
fudged.
twice the size of the US
Uh,
in population.
yes. And of course, much more cultural barriers than the U.S. And
Yeah.
this isn't going to turn into a rant about why the European Union is a joke. But with that being said, with the rising fuel prices, and from an American's perspective, and I think to a lesser extent because Canada, just a North American perspective in general, the car is the symbol of ultimate freedom. I'm sure you all remember the old saying, "You can go anywhere with a car," or I suppose it's updated is used to be go anywhere with a car. And I've seen the pictures. I can't remember exactly where it's from, but it's just in the late '80s, and gas prices are below $2 a gallon, and it's just this guy in this really slick outfit just filling up his tank of his really nice car. So from that perspective, it is a very individualistic item that allows you to transport yourself rather than relying on trains, planes, buses, or any other public transportation. And of course, depending on the country, whether it's more rural or urban, or what its particular laws and how its particular structure is, just infrastructurally, car ownership is going to be higher in some countries than in others. There is this somehow misconception, I don't have the map here, that Europeans just don't own cars. While there are more Europeans who don't own cars, like proportional wise, as compared to Americans or Canadians, there are still a lot of cars on that continent and even in the British Isles where, and once again keep in mind that like the United States, like Canada, all virtually all of continental Europe, I think except like Monaco, drives on the right hand side. So with the Schengen zone, you could conceivably again drive to countries, and you look at the size of these countries compared to the United States and U.S. states, it's you could take a day trip to another country by car. And some people in the U.S. can do that, whether to the much more hostile land of Mexico or to Canada to a certain extent. I remember hearing stories from my parents how before 9/11 there were large swaths of the border where they would just wave you through unchecked if they didn't get a really bad feeling about you. And with all that being said, number one, the price of fuel to just operate the vehicles. Number two, the cost of the vehicles themselves, and considering the fact most automobiles have to be financed, especially if they're new, that's an obligation a lot of people at this very tight time aren't willing to take on. Now, I know the average car on the American road is something around 11 or 12 years old. I don't know what that statistic looks like for Canada, the UK, or the rest of Europe, but I can't imagine it's much better or possibly even worse.
Yes, uh, I would agree.
But that is all I had about the current energy crisis and the situation in Europe. And if you have any other last minute topics, I will certainly hand it over to you. If not, I will go ahead and bring the show to a close.
The only thing I see is, unfortunately, the Israelis have started bombing Damascus again. Most of the missiles have been intercepted, but um, some have gotten through, and they've killed 3 Syrian soldiers. So,
Once again, Israel
and
back to
unfortunately,
the kind of aggression we would have saw 4 or 5 years ago. So that situation is escalating, which on the other hand shows a degree of Israeli desperation. And
yeah.
let's see, that is all I had for today's episode. I once again reiterate, if you're looking to take a trip to Europe, you're in the golden zone to go cheaply and to take advantage of the current crisis there, because probably by the end of this year at latest, if not sooner, uh, traveling might be ill-advised due to civil unrest. But I am not a State Department official. I have never claimed to be, and this is not official advice. This is just my personal opinion, and that is all I have for today.
Yeah, and that's all I have too.
So thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report. And this flash of inspiration just came to me, and I have to end the show this way. Let's go, Brandon.
Dark Bra- Dark Brandon. Let's go,
Yeah,
Dark
yeah,
Brandon.
yes.
I love
Unironically,
Dark Brandon. That's
yeah,
hilarious.
yes. The Brandon memes have been the best boomer and best boomer offshoot memes I think I've ever seen. So I thoroughly enjoy them. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and there'll be plenty more Brandon to come. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you and take care.